Hello, my name is Joshua Woods, and I am a pastor in the Church of the Nazarene. And I have been I'm a subscriber to Redeemed Zoomer, and I really appreciate a lot of the content that he puts out. And there are some things that he said with regards to schism um, that I'd like to address. You see, over the last several years, I've spent a great deal of time thinking about the nature of the church, Christian unity, denominational identity, and the problem of schism. And I think a lot of Christians, especially younger Christians, trying to take history and ecclesiology seriously, are wrestling with these same questions right now, even if they wouldn't necessarily use those words. Part of the reason for that is the modern Protestant is that modern Protestantism, say that 5 times fast, often feels deeply fragmented and unstable. Churches split, denominations divide, and congregations drift theologically. And in reaction to that, many Christians have started looking for something more rooted, um, or historically continuous, visibly unified. There's been a large shift of especially young men going to joining the an Orthodox uh, body or a Roman Catholic body, and some to mainline or alternative mainline institutions. And that is part of why voices like Redeem Zoomer have resonated with so many people online. He is trying to push back against the shallow individualism and consumerism that have often characterized modern evangelical culture. He wants Christians to take the visible church seriously, to value continuity, and to resist the instinct to abandon institutions every time conflict appears. And I think that he is right about a lot of that, and I appreciate many of the things that he has to say. Christians should not treat the church like a voluntary association built around personal preference. Division is not a trivial matter. The United, the New Testament speaks very seriously about the unity of the church, and Protestants in particular have not always handled that responsibility. The proposed solutions create problems of their own, especially when institutional continuity begins to take priority over doctrinal and sacramental integrity. And that is where I begin to part ways with Redeemed Zoomer's approach to schism and denominational loyalty. As I understand his position, and if I get anything wrong, I encourage leave a message. I just ask you to be as charitable as I'm trying to be. The basic idea, as I understand his position, the basic idea is that Christians should remain within historically rooted and visibly continuous church bodies whenever possible, even if those churches are compromised. Conservatives should stay inside those institutions, contend for orthodoxy, and work for reform rather than separating. That is essentially the reasoning behind the Reconquista idea in mainline Protestantism. And he practices what he preaches. Redeemed Zoomer himself remains within the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, despite acknowledging serious theological deviation from orthodoxy. With general approach appears in parts of the Anglican world where conservatives are urged to remain within structures tied to the Anglican communion, even when there are profound disagreements over sexuality, marriage, scriptural authority, and ordination. Now, again, I understand the instinct behind this. The church is not to be handled like a lump of Play Doh. Christians should not divide lightly. There is something deeply unhealthy about a culture where every disagreement immediately results in another split. But eventually, a deeper question has to be asked. What are the limits of remaining? Redeemed Zoomer and others like him might say remain at all costs, or remain uh, until you're forced out. But stay in reform sounds compelling in theory, but in practice, it can become a kind of indefinite coexistence with doctrinal error under the assumption that institutional continuity must be preserved almost no matter what. I think one of the places this becomes especially complicated is in the way the Arian controversy gets used rhetorically in modern discussions about schism. I have heard Redeemed Zoomer say something to this effect, maybe not word for word. St. Athanasius did not go and start his own church in the desert. He stayed. Okay? But historically, the situation was much messier than that simplified version makes it sound. Athanasius was not defending institutional cohesion. He was defending Nicene orthodoxy. For him, the church was identified by fidelity to the apostolic faith, not merely by possession of ecclesiastical office or institutional machinery. And during large portions of the Arian controversy, the institutional machinery of the church was actively working against Nicene orthodoxy. Orthodox bishops were exiled. Imperial pressure distorted councils. Episcopal sees were occupied by Arians or semi-Arians. Athanasius himself spent years in exile. I believe he was exiled, what, 5 times? There were periods where much of the visible power structure of the church was aligned against the very theology later recognized as orthodox. The historical reality actually reveals that the situation was confrontational, chaotic, and deeply painful. The Orthodox priests and bishops, along with Athanasius, did not simply remain obedient, waiting for the Arian leadership to see the light. More importantly, the Fathers did not treat institutional continuity as an absolute category detached from doctrine. They condemned schism, yes, but they also severely condemned heresy. The question testing what constitutes the true church involved apostolic doctrine, sacramental fidelity, and orthodox confession. The answer at the time was not about remaining loyal and obedient to the individuals legally possessing the office of bishop. The issue of who controlled legal episcopal authority was more about who held the visible power, which at the time was subject to imperial corruption. That is why Athanasius could regard bishops occupying legitimate sees as nevertheless standing outside the truth of the church. In other words, the Nicene position recognized apostolic faith as the foundational ontology of the church, even if institutional power temporarily opposes it. Because Athanasius resisted aggressively while claiming continuity with the true, small c, Catholic faith over against compromised authorities, he ignored hostile synods. He continued ministerial activity while condemned. He operated from exile, even ordaining other Orthodox priests inside the jurisdictions of Arian bishops. He relied on dissident clergy and monastic networks. In practical terms, parts of the Nicene resistance looked very close to the kinds of parallel movements modern anti-schism rhetoric often condemns. That does not justify endless fragmentation or radical individualism, but it does mean the Arian controversy cannot simply function as a proof text for unconditional institutional loyalty. The Fathers neither treated visible institutions as irrelevant nor treated them as indefectible regardless of doctrine. They held those things in tension. And honestly, I think that tension is difficult to fit neatly into modern denominational apologetics. This becomes even more complicated once you move beyond ordinary church attendance and start talking about ordained ministry. A layperson can sometimes remain inside a broad church body while quietly disagreeing with aspects of denominational teaching. But clergy do not have that luxury forever, especially in sacramental traditions. Let's look at the Anglican Communion, for instance. A priest ministers publicly under ecclesial authority. He takes vows. He administers sacraments in the name of that church. His disagreements cannot remain permanently theoretical because eventually they intersect with pastoral and sacramental responsibilities. And this is where a lot of internet level discussion about just stay in the Episcopal Church stops sounding realistic to me. If a priest sincerely believes from Scripture and the teaching of the Church that persistent, public, unrepentant sexual immorality places someone outside proper Eucharistic fellowship, then eventually he is going to collide with the practical realities of ministry. At some point, he may be expected, either explicitly or implicitly, to administer communion in situations where he believes that he should not. He may be expected to recognize moral categories or relationships that he believes Scripture does not recognize. At the very least, he will be required to stand aside and allow another priest to use the parish under his own charge to do that which his conscience and Scripture do not permit him to do. This would be equally outrageous to him. So, to be more clear, hypothetically, if I were an Episcopal priest, I'm not. I'm a pastor in the Church of the Nazarene. But if I were, and I were asked to do a same-sex wedding, and I said I could not, I would still be required, per the directions of the bishop in my diocese, to allow another bishop to come into my parish or my church and perform that ceremony. And that is just as much. How can I allow that to happen? Yeah, that's just not something that would be acceptable. So eventually, well-meaning exhortations toward visible unity, i.e., living in love and faith, uh, as put forward by the Church of England, stop being enough. Because now a priest has to decide what faithfulness actually requires in practice. And I can already anticipate the response. Better to suffer discipline or defrocking inside the church than participate in schism by leaving it. But I think that response still assumes something that has not actually been demonstrated, namely that institutional continuity is the supreme ecclesial good, even in situations involving persistent doctrinal and moral corruption. The problem is that Paul does not speak that way in 1 Corinthians. When addressing sexual immorality within the church, Paul's language is severe. He says not even to eat with the so-called brother who remains openly and unrepentantly immoral. He speaks of removing the man from among them and even handing him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Whether someone agrees with the traditional Christian sexual ethic or not is almost beside the point here. The point is that Paul clearly believes that there are situations where preserving the moral and doctrinal integrity of the church requires visible boundaries and actual discipline. And that creates a real problem for the just stay argument. Because eventually, a priest may find himself in a position where remaining faithful to his bishop or denomination would require him to act against what he sincerely believes Scripture and small c Catholic tradition demand. And I do not think the New Testament treats institutional continuity as the highest ecclesial good in every possible situation. There is also a practical assumption buried inside a lot of these conversations that often goes unquestioned, especially online. People talk as though conservatives inside denominations like the Episcopal Church can simply retreat into conservative parishes and equally coexist within the broader structure while disagreeing with the denomination's trajectory. That may exist in some places, especially in the eastern United States, but it is far less realistic across large portions of the rural western United States and Canada for that matter. In many areas, there is not a network of conservative Episcopal parishes available. There may be one parish within driving distance, one bishop, one diocesan culture, one practical expression of the denomination. The theological direction of the broader institution dictates the reality in parish life, sacramental expectations, pastoral oversight, and public witness. And that reality makes the just stay and reform model much harder to normalize than many people seem to assume. There is also a broader theological issue underneath all of this, involving the use of Old Testament Israel as a controlling analogy for the church. One of Redeemed Zoomer's arguments for maintaining institutional unity at all costs appeal directly or indirectly to Israel remaining one covenant people despite periods of corruption and apostasy. But that parallel has to be handled carefully. Israel was a covenant nation tied to land, genealogy, and a centralized political religious culture. The church under the new covenant is not structured in exactly the same way. The continuity is real, but it is not a one-to-one. The church is transnational and ordered around union with Christ rather than inter or even intra-national cohesion. So while the New Testament absolutely emphasizes unity, it also repeatedly prioritizes fidelity to apostolic teaching. And that leads into another uncomfortable point that I think Roman Catholics sometimes raise legitimately, even if I do not think Rome ultimately solves the issue as neatly as it claims. There really is something artificial about declaring groups unified when they are spiritually, doctrinally, and sacramentally opposed to one another in profound ways. At some point along the way, unity can become merely administrative or rhetorical rather than real. Because the New Testament does not treat unity as a purely visual category, Christian unity is connected to shared confession, shared faith, shared sacramental life, and shared submission to apostolic teaching. To be clear, there are dangers on both sides of this conversation. One danger is endless fragmentation, where every disagreement produces another split. That's a problem. But the opposite danger is pretending unity exists where fundamental theological and moral division already dominates the life of the church. And I think parts of modern Christianity, including portions of both Protestantism and the historic communions, are struggling with exactly that problem. None of this is an argument for denominational consumerism or endless schism. Christians should not divide lightly. Unity is very important. John chapter 17 proves this in Jesus' high priestly prayer. The visible witness of the church is important. But institutional continuity is not all that matters, or it's not even the most important thing. At some point, an individual, a congregation, or even a diocese or district must ask themselves whether they should remain within a doctrinally comprised structure and risk ceasing to be faithful and become participants in error. And I do not think that question can be answered merely by appealing to the age, size, or historical continuity of an institution. I want to thank Redeemed Zoomer for his zeal in these matters. He is saying some things that many who may actually have committed schism or left the church over more trivial matters need to hear, and his voice acts as a counterweight against a rush towards separation or realignment. I pray earnestly for his and others' efforts toward Reconquista. As it is, I'm a cradle Nazarene, and so my situation is different. But I honestly hope that reform can come to institutions like the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, and others that I may not be thinking of at the moment. But as we go forward, Redeemed Zoomer and Young Anglican and all those who are um, promoting uh, unity, I pray for you. I pray for your churches, and I pray that you are successful in your attempts at at reconquering and reforming your denominations. God bless you. Uh, Hope you have a great day. And oh, I guess maybe I should say this. Um, I am just getting back to YouTube after a long um, absence in posting anything. So if you want to hear more of this, or you want to engage, or have a dialogue, or say something back, just the only request I have is that you would try to be charitable, and remember that we in this debate are all children of Christ, and in that spirit of unity, let us treat one another with love. As Jesus says, they will know we are Christians by treat one another with love. As Jesus says, they will know we are Christians by how we love one another. So, God bless you, and please, if you want to subscribe and hit the like button and all that stuff. I don't like getting into it much, but um, I'd like to um, I'd like to perhaps increase my involvement and my engagement um, on YouTube. All right, thank you so much. We will see you soon.